My daughter-in-law sent my wife an 18-dish Thanksgiving list and ordered her to cook alone, so I booked us both a flight and left a note. Her call came mid-dinner. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The glow of the tablet screen illuminated the exhausted lines on Patricia's face. The kitchen of our Oak Park home was quiet save for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the harsh, freezing wind rattling the window panes. I sat across the oak table nursing a cup of black coffee, watching my wife of 40 years shrink into herself. Her calloused hands that had built a life from nothing, trembled as she scrolled through the email. It was from Vanessa, our daughter-in-law. There was no greeting. There was no warmth. The subject line read simply, "Thanksgiving menu requirements." Patricia pushed the tablet toward me, her eyes brimming with a quiet, defeated humiliation. I pulled the screen closer. The document was an 18-course culinary mandate formatted like a corporate directive. Vanessa demanded Patricia arrive at their Lake Forest estate precisely at 4 in the morning. She was to prepare an extravagant feast for 30 of Vanessa's elite socialite friends. The menu detailed artisan beef, Wellington truffle-infused macaroni, hand-whipped soufflés, and imported saffron reductions. But the menu was not the poison. The poison was in the instructions at the bottom. Vanessa explicitly stated that Patricia must use the service entrance to avoid tracking snow onto the Italian marble foyer. She ordered my wife to remain confined to the kitchen throughout the entire preparation and to leave before the guests arrived at 5 in the evening. Vanessa wrote that she required the main floor to herself to entertain and look presentable, banishing the woman who birthed her husband to the role of a silent, invisible caterer. A ghost meant to labor in the shadows so Vanessa could accept the praise. I stared at the words, feeling a cold, heavy knot form in my chest. Patricia tried to offer a weak smile, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. She murmured that Vanessa was just under a lot of pressure with her new social circle, that it was fine, that she could handle the cooking. The sheer audacity of the demand filled the room with a suffocating tension. They did not view Patricia as a mother. They viewed her as unpaid, disposable help. For years, we had tolerated Vanessa's condescending remarks about our modest lifestyle, her sneers at Patricia's practical clothing, and her blatant disregard for our time. But this crossed a sacred boundary. I looked at the woman who had stood by my side when we had nothing but instant noodles and a leaky roof, the woman who had poured her entire soul into raising our son. I felt the absolute death of my patience. I reached across the table, took the tablet from her shaking hands, and turned the screen face down. I picked up my phone and dialed my son. The line rang 3 times before Connor answered. The heavy, thumping bass of an upscale downtown Chicago lounge immediately flooded the speaker, accompanied by the clinking of crystal glasses and overlapping pretentious laughter. I demanded an explanation for the insulting list his wife had just sent his mother. Connor let out a loud, irritated sigh, the sound of a man severely inconvenienced by the people who gave him life. He slurred his words, slightly defensive and dripping with arrogance. He told me Vanessa was stressed about hosting the partners from his venture capital firm, that they needed the event to be absolutely flawless to secure their status in the neighborhood. I asked him why his mother was instructed to use the service door and vanish before dinner. Connor scoffed loudly enough for his friends in the background to hear. He said I was being overly sensitive, completely missing the bigger picture. He casually remarked that Patricia was best suited for the kitchen anyway, that she lacked the social grace to mingle with high-net-worth investors. He claimed her outdated sweaters and quiet demeanor would embarrass them in front of people who actually mattered. Connor delivered the final fatal blow with a chilling nonchalance. He stated that Patricia and I should feel privileged to contribute to our son's social climbing, that cooking for his friends was the least we could do since we clearly had no social lives of our own. I gripped the phone, the plastic digging into my palm. I remembered working double shifts at the engineering firm, sacrificing my own health to pay his college tuition in full. I remembered Patricia staying up all night typing his scholarship essays. I listened to the stranger on the other end of the line, a man entirely corrupted by greed and a desperate need for superficial validation. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or demand respect. Respect begged for is no respect at all. I simply ended the call. The click of the disconnect echoed in the quiet kitchen. The silence that followed marked the absolute death of a father's blind devotion. There would be no more second chances, no more turning a blind eye to their cruelty. The time for unconditional patience was over. I left the kitchen and walked slowly down the hall to my study. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I did not shatter glass or scream into the void. Anger is an unpredictable emotion, but resolve is a deadly focused weapon. I sat at my solid mahogany desk, a relic from my 40 years as a structural engineer, and powered on my desktop computer. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. I opened my encrypted financial portfolios, bypassing layers of security until the raw data of my life's work filled the monitor. Connor and Vanessa operated under a massive delusion. Because Patricia and I chose to remain in our modest Oak Park home because I drove a dependable 15-year-old sedan, and because we bought our clothes on sale, they assumed we were surviving on a meager fixed income. They mistook our humility for poverty. They mistook our quiet lifestyle for weakness. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with. I pulled up the property deeds and corporate tax filings. The drip-fed reality of their luxurious existence bled onto the screen. The sprawling multi-million-dollar Lake Forest estate Vanessa constantly flaunted to her socialite friends did not belong to them. The deed was held under a private limited liability company, an LLC that I owned entirely. I had purchased the estate as an investment and allowed them to live there rent-free, paying the exorbitant property taxes out of my own pocket to give my son a head start. The prestigious venture capital firm Connor boasted about at his expensive dinners was a hollow shell. It operated entirely on a massive commercial line of credit, a financial lifeline backed unconditionally by my own private retirement funds. They viewed me as a disposable servant, an insignificant old man taking up space completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that I owned the very ground they walked on. I provided the air they breathed in their high society bubble. As a structural engineer, my entire career was based on identifying stress points and assessing foundational integrity. Looking at the numbers, looking at the pure, unadulterated entitlement of my son and his wife, I saw a structure built entirely on rot. When a foundation is compromised beyond repair, you do not try to patch the cracks. You demolish the building. The silent adjustment began. I opened my email client and drafted a high-priority message to Warren, my aggressive and fiercely loyal wealth manager. I instructed him to prepare the immediate revocation of the commercial credit guarantees. I requested the drafted eviction notices for the Lake Forest property. Every keystroke was a calculated strike against the illusion of power my son held. I was dismantling his life not out of uncontrollable rage, but out of absolute necessity. They had demanded a servant, but they were about to face a landlord, a creditor, and a father who had finally opened his eyes. I closed the laptop, the glow fading into total darkness. The days of suffering in silence were permanently over. The study was completely silent, except for the low hum of the desktop tower and the rhythmic clicking of my mouse. I stared at the glowing monitor as the blue light cast long shadows across my mahogany desk. Decades of engineering had taught me to trust the numbers above all else. Numbers did not carry egos. Numbers did not care about social standing or neighborhood gossip. They only revealed the unvarnished truth of structural integrity. I logged into the master portal of the commercial banking accounts, and my fingers moved with a cold and deliberate precision. 5 years ago, I had co-signed a massive commercial line of credit to launch Connor's venture capital firm. It was the ultimate gesture of a father's faith and a financial safety net designed to give my only son the leverage he needed to build his own legacy in the competitive Chicago market. I had never audited the daily ledgers because I chose to trust the boy I had raised. That trust died the moment I opened the transaction history. I pulled up the quarterly expense reports, and I expected to find the typical markers of a struggling business. I braced myself for overpaid consultants or bloated marketing budgets or failed investment rounds. Instead, the spreadsheets painted a picture of absolute and unadulterated theft. Row after row of transactions flowed directly from the corporate credit line into the bottomless pit of Vanessa's vanity. I scrolled down the screen and my jaw clenched as the reality of their lifestyle materialized in black and white. A $50,000 transfer was flagged as a corporate retreat. The attached routing number traced back to an exclusive members-only resort in the Maldives. Connor and Vanessa had spent a month lounging on private beaches, funded entirely by the retirement capital I had spent 40 years building on freezing construction sites. The deeper I dug into the archives, the more the illusion of their success unraveled. Their entire existence was a carefully orchestrated fraud. The luxury vehicles parked in the driveway of their Lake Forest estate were not the fruits of Connor's hard work. They were leased through a shell corporation, and the monthly payments were disguised as executive transportation allowances on the company books. The country club dues and the designer wardrobes and the weekly deliveries of imported wines were all meticulously coded as business development and client entertainment. Connor was not a brilliant venture capitalist navigating the high-stakes world of finance. He was a parasite siphoning the lifeblood from my savings to maintain a facade for a woman who viewed my wife as a disposable servant. I felt a physical ache in my chest and a profound grief for the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table and earnestly talk about building a life of purpose. That boy was gone, and he was replaced by a man who forged expense reports to buy his wife diamond tennis bracelets. I clicked on a folder labeled Vendor Disbursements. The payments went to high-end interior decorators and private landscaping firms and boutique caterers. They were using corporate funds to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth and bleeding the credit line dry while simultaneously mocking the modest lifestyle Patricia and I maintained. They despised our quiet existence, and they were completely oblivious to the fact that our frugality was the only thing keeping them from total financial ruin. The betrayal shifted from a personal insult to a calculated criminal enterprise. Connor knew exactly what he was doing. Every misclassified transaction required his direct authorization. Every fraudulent invoice carried his digital signature. He was purposefully defrauding the credit line I had personally guaranteed, and he was operating under the assumption that his elderly father would never possess the technological savvy or the suspicion to audit the accounts. He believed I was a relic of the past and a naive old man content to sit in his suburban study while his brilliant son conquered the financial world. He had tragically underestimated the very man who taught him how to count. As a structural engineer, I spent my life looking for the exact point where a load-bearing wall would buckle under too much pressure. I found the breaking point of my son's life buried in a hidden ledger. Over the past 24 months, Connor had diverted nearly $400,000 into private accounts managed by Vanessa. They were stockpiling cash and preparing for the inevitable moment the business collapsed under the weight of their extravagant spending. They were ensuring their own survival at my absolute expense. If the bank audited the firm and called in the loans, the liability would fall squarely on my shoulders. They were perfectly willing to let Patricia and me face bankruptcy and let the bank seize the home we had lived in for 40 years, just so Vanessa could continue hosting elite socialites on imported marble floors. The sorrow evaporated and was replaced by a clinical and devastating clarity. I was no longer a heartbroken father looking at a disappointing son. I was an engineer observing a condemned building and preparing to hit the detonator. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their arrogant charade. The embezzlement was not just a moral failing, because it was a severe legal violation. By defrauding a guaranteed commercial account, Connor had breached the core covenants of our financial agreement. He had given me the absolute and uncontestable authority to freeze the assets and sever the credit lines and demand immediate repayment of the misappropriated funds. I began downloading every single document and saving the damning evidence to a secure encrypted drive. I captured the fake invoices and the luxury resort receipts and the massive transfers to Vanessa's personal accounts. Every file downloaded with a quiet and satisfying finality. I was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence and a legal avalanche that they would never see coming. They thought they held all the power because they lived in a mansion and wore tailored suits. They failed to realize that true power does not reside in appearances. True power resides in ownership, and in truth, and in the ruthless execution of justice. I watched the progress bar on the screen fill up and secure the last batch of financial records. The house around me remained still and quiet. Patricia was upstairs packing her suitcase for a Thanksgiving she thought we would spend serving a tyrannical daughter-in-law. She had no idea that I had just secured the keys to our absolute freedom. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at the time. It was past midnight, and the financial markets would open in a few hours. I mentally drafted the conversation I would have with my wealth manager at dawn. There would be no warnings given to Connor. There would be no tearful family interventions or desperate pleas for him to change his ways. Those tactics were for parents who still believed their children could be saved through love. I knew that the only language Connor and Vanessa understood was the brutal reality of consequence. I safely ejected the hard drive and gripped the small metal rectangle in my hand. It contained the complete destruction of the life they had stolen from me. I leaned back in my leather chair and let the cool darkness of the room wash over me. The anger that had ignited in the kitchen was now a perfectly controlled flame ready to burn their illusions to ash. I had the paper trail. I had the legal right. I had the absolute determination to sever the parasite from the host. The next move would not be a conversation because it would be an execution of boundaries. I stood up from the desk ready to pack my bags for Italy and leave behind a ticking time bomb that would obliterate their fraudulent empire the moment we stepped onto the plane. The elevator doors slid open to the 42nd floor of the downtown financial district, revealing the sterile, glass-walled lobby of Becker and Associates. The air up here was thin, perfectly climate-controlled, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished steel. There were no warm greetings or unnecessary small talk as I strode past the reception desk. Warren Becker did not build his fearsome reputation by wasting time, and I did not come here to seek comfort. He was a man of numbers, binding contracts, and ruthless efficiency. We had worked together for 2 decades, navigating complex corporate structures and safeguarding the wealth I had built from the ground up through decades of grueling engineering projects. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass door to his private office without knocking. Warren looked up from a stack of legal pads, his sharp, analytical eyes immediately registering the cold, uncompromising determination in my posture. I did not sit down in the plush guest chairs. I simply tossed the encrypted flash drive onto the center of his immaculate glass desk. The small metal rectangle landed with a sharp clack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I instructed him to open the drive and examine the offshore ledgers for Connor's venture capital firm. Warren raised an eyebrow, sensing the gravity of the moment, inserted the drive into his laptop, and began to scroll. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating as my wealth manager absorbed the sheer magnitude of my own son's betrayal. Warren's expression did not change, but the rigid set of his jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He clicked systematically through the organized folders containing the luxury resort invoices, the exorbitant country club dues, and the phantom business expenses used to fund Vanessa's designer lifestyle. The glow of the monitor reflected in his glasses as he cross-referenced the routing numbers with the corporate credit line. He finally looked up at me, his voice devoid of any pity, maintaining the clinical detachment of a surgeon evaluating a terminal tumor. He stated that Connor had not merely mismanaged the operational funds, but had committed systematic, calculated commercial fraud against the guaranteed credit line. Warren reminded me of the day we established that specific limited liability company 5 years ago. We had structured it meticulously, ensuring that I retained absolute executive authority over the master capital while granting Connor operational access to build his firm. It was designed as an impenetrable safety net to catch my son if the unpredictable market turned against him. Instead, Connor had weaponized that very net to strangle my financial reserves while feeding his wife's insatiable vanity. They had drained hundreds of thousands of dollars, fully aware that a sudden bank audit would place the catastrophic liability squarely on my shoulders. Warren steepled his fingers, leaning back in his chair, and asked me a single pointed question. He asked if I wanted to mitigate the damage, quietly restrict Connor's access, and negotiate a private repayment plan to keep the family intact. Before answering, I instructed Warren to bring up the secondary ledger detailing the specific routing of the embezzled cash. He pointed out a series of recurring wire transfers to a private offshore account, registered solely in Vanessa's name. They were not merely spending my retirement funds on fleeting luxuries. They were actively hoarding stolen capital to build a separate financial fortress, anticipating the exact day the venture firm inevitably collapsed. They were planning to walk away rich, leaving me holding the explosive debt. The sheer calculation of the act extinguished any lingering flicker of paternal guilt. Connor had ceased to be my son the moment he orchestrated my financial execution to fund his wife's arrogance. He had declared war entirely unprovoked. My retaliation was simply the inevitable law of physics applied to human betrayal, where every action is met with an equal opposing and devastating reaction. There was no hesitation in my voice, and no lingering trace of parental weakness. I told Warren that the structural foundation was rotten to the absolute core, compromised beyond any hope of repair, and we were going to demolish the entire building today. Warren nodded, a grim, predatory satisfaction settling over his features. He pressed a button on his intercom and instructed his senior paralegal to cancel all his afternoon appointments and hold all incoming calls. The elegant office instantly transformed into a war room. We did not discuss Connor's childhood, nor did I shed a tear over my heartbreak. We dealt strictly in legal absolute truths, turning betrayal into actionable leverage. Warren pulled up the master agreements for the commercial accounts, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The first strike was the operational credit line. With 3 decisive keystrokes, Warren drafted an immediate, irrevocable freeze on the venture capital firm's funding. He explained the cascading consequences with a cold precision. The moment the bank processed the executive order, Connor's corporate credit cards would decline globally. The payroll accounts would lock down immediately. The phantom business that afforded him his arrogant swagger would cease to exist in the financial system. Connor would be left holding plastic rectangles that carried absolutely no purchasing power. The second strike required a more aggressive legal maneuver. Warren drafted a formal, unyielding demand for the immediate repayment of the misallocated funds. By legally classifying the extravagant expenditures as unauthorized personal diversions rather than business losses, we completely stripped Connor of any corporate liability protection. The corporate veil was pierced with surgical accuracy. The massive debt was now his direct personal burden, attached to his social security number, destroying his credit score and obliterating his future borrowing power. Warren printed the final addendum, placing a legal hold on all associated personal accounts linked to the corporate line, ensuring that the offshore stash would be frozen pending a full forensic audit. Then we moved to the masterpiece of our strategy, which was the ultimate leverage point, the Lake Forest estate. Warren pulled the original property deed from the digital archives. The sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion that Vanessa constantly flaunted as her own kingdom was legally held exclusively by the holding company I controlled entirely. Connor and Vanessa were legally classified as nothing more than month-to-month tenants operating under a verbal agreement, paying 0 rent while I quietly covered the crushing property taxes. Warren began typing the eviction notice. The legal jargon was cold, precise, and completely devoid of emotion or familial leniency. They were given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises, hand over all sets of keys, and leave the property in immaculate condition, or face immediate forceful removal by the county sheriff. Every document Warren printed and stacked neatly on the edge of the desk felt like a loaded weapon, perfectly calibrated to destroy the illusion of superiority Vanessa had weaponized against my wife. The thick stack of manila envelopes sat between us, representing the absolute and undeniable end of my son's privileged existence. Warren picked up his heavy fountain pen, ready to sign the final authorizations as my legal proxy. He asked me when I wanted the private process servers to deliver the notices. He suggested filing them with the courts immediately, letting the devastating chips fall by noon today, ensuring Connor would be locked out of his office before lunch. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the sprawling, icy Chicago skyline. I pictured Patricia's calloused, trembling hands holding that tablet. I thought about that 18-course menu demand. I thought about Vanessa ordering the woman who gave her husband life to use the service entrance like a stray dog, demanding she cook in the shadows and vanish before the real guests arrived. The pure, unadulterated disrespect required a consequence of absolute equal magnitude. I turned back to Warren, stepping away from the glass, and gave him my exact, unalterable instructions. I told him to hold the delivery until Thursday. I wanted the lead process server to arrive at the Lake Forest estate at precisely 5 o'clock in the evening. Warren paused his pen, hovering an inch above the paper. A slow, knowing smile spread across his sharp face as he realized the devastating implication of the timing. 5 o'clock on Thursday was the exact moment Vanessa's 30 elite socialite guests, including the investors, the country club presidents, and the neighborhood influencers, would be arriving in their luxury cars. It was the exact moment they would be taking their seats at the grand dining table, expecting a flawless, extravagant feast. It was the precise hour Vanessa expected Patricia to silently slip out the back door so she could claim the glory of the evening entirely for herself. I wanted the legal papers handed to Connor and Vanessa right in the grand foyer, directly in front of every single person they were desperately trying to impress. I wanted the eviction notice read aloud if they refused to take the envelope. I wanted the total illusion of their high society status to shatter publicly, irreparably, and spectacularly. Warren signed the documents with a firm, heavy stroke, the ink binding my son to his inevitable ruin. He sealed the papers into the manila envelopes and handed them to his paralegal with strict timed delivery instructions. The trap was flawlessly set. The legal avalanche was now suspended right above their heads, waiting for the perfect, most humiliating moment to drop. I walked out of the sterile office and stepped back into the elevator. I had entered the building carrying the heavy burden of a discarded, disrespected father. I left as an architect of ruin, a man who had reclaimed his absolute authority, ready to board a flight to Italy, while my son's entire fraudulent world burned to the ground. I opened a new tab on the secure browser and stared at the blinking cursor. The financial battle was already set in motion through the legal documents signed downtown, but a proper ambush required absolute physical distance to be truly devastating. I navigated to a premier international airline portal. The screen illuminated my face with a bright, welcoming white light that provided a stark contrast to the grim corporate ledgers I had just spent hours scrutinizing. I typed the destination into the search bar with deliberate keystrokes. Florence, Italy. We had spent our honeymoon there 40 years ago, wandering the cobblestone streets with empty pockets and hearts full of ambition. We had always promised each other we would return, but Connor's university tuition and his first luxury car and his initial startup capital had always taken brutal precedence over our own happiness. Tonight, the endless well of Connor's funding was officially and permanently terminated. I selected 2 first-class tickets departing from Chicago at 6 in the morning. The premium fare was merely a fraction of what Vanessa routinely spent on a single country club gala using my stolen retirement funds. Yet it bought something entirely priceless. It bought our immediate liberation. I entered my personal platinum card details and pressed confirm. The itinerary appeared on the screen as a digital declaration of independence. I printed 2 copies and listened to the machine whir quietly in the corner of the study, finalizing the transaction that would sever our chains. I left the study and walked silently up the carpeted stairs. The house was enveloped in a deep, freezing silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a massive, destructive storm. I bypassed our master bedroom and went straight to the hallway closet at the end of the corridor. I reached up to the highest shelf and pulled down our two largest hard-shell suitcases. They were heavy and coated in a fine layer of gray dust. We had not taken a real vacation in nearly a decade. Every holiday and every long weekend had been aggressively commandeered by Vanessa's elite social calendar or Connor's sudden manufactured business crises. I carried the suitcases into the guest room and laid them flat on the bare mattress. I moved methodically, opening dresser drawers and carefully selecting garments. I entirely bypassed the stiff, uncomfortable suits I usually wore to Connor's awkward corporate dinners, where I was paraded around as a silent prop. I packed comfortable linens and warm cashmere sweaters and sturdy walking shoes. I was no longer packing for an audience of pretentious socialites who judged my worth by the logo on my lapel. I was packing for a life fully reclaimed. The physical act of folding the garments felt incredibly therapeutic. Every shirt placed in the luggage was a conscious, deliberate rejection of the toxic expectations we had labored under for years. I packed Patricia's favorite silk blouses, including the beautiful, vibrant ones she never wore because Vanessa always insisted her mother-in-law dress in drab, neutral colors to avoid clashing with the dining room decor. The faint metallic rustling of the luggage zipper finally broke the absolute silence of the second floor. The bedroom door creaked open, and Patricia stood in the frame. She clutched her worn cotton bathrobe tightly around her shoulders, and her eyes were incredibly heavy with exhaustion and sudden confusion. She glanced at the digital wall clock, which read barely 2 a.m. Pure, unadulterated panic immediately flashed across her gentle features. She asked frantically if she had overslept, and her voice trembled with the deeply ingrained fear of missing Vanessa's tyrannical cooking schedule. She moved quickly toward the stairs, muttering rapidly that she needed to begin prepping the massive turkey and that the artisan bread dough needed time to rise, and that Vanessa would be absolutely furious if the kitchen was not fully operational by 4 a.m. Her immediate instinct was to serve and to absorb the emotional punishment and to sacrifice her own physical well-being, just to maintain a false, fragile peace in our son's extravagant home. Watching the woman I loved more than life itself reduced to a state of absolute terrified subservience snapped the final tether of my restraint. I stepped directly into her path and placed my hands gently but firmly on her trembling shoulders, stopping her frantic movements completely. I looked directly into her tired, beautiful eyes. I did not raise my voice or show any anger, but I spoke with a crushing, undeniable finality. I told her that she was never stepping foot inside that hostile kitchen ever again. I reached into my chest pocket and handed her the freshly printed airline itinerary. Patricia stared at the crisp white paper, while her eyes scanned the flight details and the European destination and the premium boarding times. She looked up at me completely bewildered and asked what would happen to the elaborate Thanksgiving feast, and what would happen to the 30 elite guests, and what would happen to Connor when he woke up to an empty house. I told her the absolute brutal truth. I told her that our days of unpaid servitude were permanently over. I explained calmly that we had spent decades building a massive financial and emotional foundation for a son who only viewed us as disposable stepping stones. I told her that tonight the foundation had been permanently removed and the entire structure was about to collapse. I instructed her to pack her travel bag immediately because we were leaving the heavy burden of their toxic expectations behind us forever. Patricia stood frozen for a long moment as the heavy weight of my words slowly dismantled years of cruel emotional conditioning. I watched the realization wash over her features, replacing the sheer panic with a profound, quiet grace. She did not argue or ask for further explanations regarding the logistics of the fallout. She simply nodded and turned around and walked to her closet to retrieve her heavy traveling coat. We finished packing the remaining toiletries and garments in an efficient, highly focused silence. We carried our luggage down the stairs and out into the freezing Chicago air. The bitter wind whipped fiercely across the paved driveway, but I had never felt a deeper warmth in my chest. I loaded the heavy suitcases into the trunk of the car and held the passenger door open for my wife. We drove away from the house long before the sun began to rise, leaving the dark, quiet suburbs far behind us. The highway stretched out before the windshield, completely empty and remarkably inviting. We were not cowardly running away from our family responsibilities. We were confidently walking away from a parasitic transaction disguised as love and stepping boldly into the absolute freedom we had finally earned. The digital clock on the dashboard of my sedan read 3 in the morning. The streets of Oak Park were buried under a fresh layer of pristine white snow. The tires crunched softly against the frozen asphalt as I navigated the winding roads toward Lake Forest. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, perfectly still. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. For 40 years, she had spent this exact morning hour covered in flour and frantic energy. She would have been awake since midnight, stressing over oven temperatures and basting schedules. Today she wore a tailored wool coat and held a leather passport wallet. The heater blasted warm air through the vents, but the real warmth came from the absolute clarity of our mission. The silence inside the car was thick, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of total liberation. I turned the steering wheel and the headlights swept across the towering iron gates of the estate. The heavy metal doors parted smoothly, recognizing the security transponder mounted on my windshield. It was a security system I paid a premium to maintain every single month. I guided the car up the long private road and parked at the edge of the circular driveway, leaving the engine running in the freezing dark. The massive stone mansion loomed ahead like a silent, sleeping giant. Every single window was completely black. Inside that sprawling fortress, Connor and Vanessa were fast asleep under a blanket of pure, unadulterated entitlement. They were resting peacefully under the absolute certainty that the invisible help would arrive through the service entrance before dawn. They fully expected to wake up at noon to the rich aroma of roasting meats and imported truffles. They expected the magic to simply happen. They believed the feast would manifest out of thin air, while they prepared themselves to accept the admiration of their wealthy friends. I stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. The freezing air stung my cheeks and burned my lungs, but I welcomed the sharp sensation. It made me feel incredibly awake. I reached into my heavy overcoat pocket and pulled out a small stack of index cards securely bound by a thick rubber band. They were Patricia's most treasured recipes. These were the exact culinary instructions Vanessa had ruthlessly commanded her to execute. The paper felt heavy in my gloved hands. It represented decades of my wife pouring her love into a family that eventually viewed her as a disposable catering service. I walked up the meticulously shoveled slate pathway. The sound of my leather shoes clicking against the stone echoed in the quiet neighborhood. I did not walk around the side of the house to the service entrance. I did not skulk in the shadows like a hired hand. I marched directly up the 3 wide stone steps and stood squarely on the main welcome mat. The grand mahogany front door stood before me like a massive wooden shield. I pulled a single bright yellow sticky note from my breast pocket, along with a heavy black permanent marker. I pressed the small square of paper against the solid wood, leaning my entire weight into the door. My handwriting was steady and deliberate. I wrote the words with the exact precision of an engineer drafting a final, undeniable contract. The ink bled slightly into the yellow paper. The recipes are in the kitchen drawer. We are away. Have a joyful Thanksgiving. I peeled the backing off the note and smoothed it flat against the very center of the dark mahogany door at perfect eye level. The bright yellow square was a screaming beacon against the dark polished wood. It was absolutely impossible to miss. It was the first thing they would see when they inevitably panicked and rushed to the front door to see why the house was empty. I bent down and slid the thick stack of index cards right beneath the heavy brass door knocker. I ensured they were tucked safely out of the wind, waiting patiently for Vanessa to discover exactly how much physical labor went into the lifestyle she so casually demanded. I took one step back and looked at the silent house. A wave of profound finality washed over me. There was no anger left in my chest. The rage had burned away hours ago, leaving only cold, hard ash. There was no sorrow for the son I had lost to greed. There was only the mathematical certainty of a structural collapse. Connor had built his entire world on a foundation of my money and his mother's endless sacrifices. I had just removed the cornerstone. The impending destruction was simply gravity taking its natural course. I turned around and walked back down the slate pathway. The freezing wind whipped at my coat and tore at my face, but my steps were lighter than they had been in a decade. I reached the driveway, opened the heavy car door, and slid back into the driver's seat. Patricia looked at me, her eyes shining brightly in the faint green glow of the dashboard. She did not ask if I had second thoughts. She did not ask what would happen to the dinner party. She simply reached across the center console and placed her hand over mine. I shifted the car into drive. I did not look back at the dark mansion in the rearview mirror. I pressed my foot against the accelerator and steered the car away from the silent, wealthy neighborhood. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for the international terminal. The trap was flawlessly set, and the fuse was officially lit. The sustained roar of the jet engines pressing us backward into our plush leather seats acted as an impenetrable barrier against the impending chaos we had left behind in Chicago. As the heavy aircraft pierced through the thick layer of freezing gray clouds and leveled out into the brilliant morning sun, I felt the last lingering threads of obligation snap and fall away. The cabin was a sanctuary of hushed voices, soft ambient lighting, and immaculate service. It was a stark departure from the tense, demanding atmosphere that usually governed our holidays. I looked over at Patricia. She was staring out the small oval window at the endless expanse of blue sky. Her hands, which had been trembling just hours ago under the weight of an impossible culinary mandate, now rested peacefully on the crisp linen blanket provided by the flight attendant. The knot of anxiety that had permanently settled in my chest over the past 3 years finally began to loosen. I ordered 2 glasses of sparkling water and leaned back, allowing the sheer velocity of our departure to wash over me. We were moving at 600 miles an hour away from a lifetime of unappreciated sacrifices, and for the first time since my son had married into his pretentious social circle, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I watched a single tear trace a slow path down Patricia's cheek. It caught the morning light before vanishing into the collar of her wool coat. I knew that tear did not stem from sorrow or regret. It was the physical manifestation of profound, overwhelming relief. It was the silent release of decades spent shrinking herself to fit into the margins of our son's escalating ambition. I thought back to the autumn Connor turned 14, when Patricia quietly sold her late mother's heirloom pearl necklace just to cover the tuition deposit for the elite preparatory school he begged to attend. She had done it gladly, asking for nothing but his success in return. To see that same devotion repaid with an email ordering her to use a service entrance and scrub pots in the shadows was a desecration of everything we had built. Vanessa had treated my wife's boundless grace as a weakness to be exploited. But gazing at Patricia, now bathed in the tranquil light of the cabin, I saw the restoration of her dignity. I reached across the wide armrest and enveloped her hand in mine. Her fingers felt warm and steady. She turned away from the window, met my eyes, and offered a soft, unburdened smile. No words were required between us. The altitude had granted us a perspective we had desperately lacked on the ground. The higher we climbed, the smaller and more insignificant Connor and Vanessa's superficial empire appeared. Hours melted away into a seamless transition of time zones and shifting landscapes. We descended into Italy as the late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue over the rolling hills. The transition from the biting, hostile winter of Illinois to the crisp, welcoming Mediterranean breeze was jarring, but immensely restorative. A private driver awaited us at the terminal, guiding us away from the crowded city and winding down the serpentine coastal roads toward Amalfi. The world outside our window transformed into a breathtaking canvas of sheer cliffs, ancient terraced vineyards, and the vast, glittering expanse of the Tyrrhenian Sea. We arrived at a secluded stone villa perched high above the crashing waves. The air smelled of salt, crushed lemon leaves, and damp earth. It was a sensory resurrection. Our host swung open the heavy wooden doors to reveal a living space bathed in natural light, featuring terracotta floors and a wide stone balcony that seemed to hang directly over the edge of the world. The profound silence of the villa was the most striking luxury of all. There were no ringing phones demanding immediate financial transfers. There were no frantic text messages berating us for choosing the wrong brand of imported caviar. There was only the rhythmic, timeless sound of the ocean breathing against the rocks below. The immense physical distance we had placed between ourselves and Chicago perfectly mirrored the absolute emotional detachment I had finally achieved. I walked over to the small rustic kitchen area and retrieved a dusty bottle of vintage Barolo the host had left on the granite counter as a welcome gift. I uncorked the wine, the rich earthy aroma filling the space, and poured the deep ruby liquid into 2 crystal glasses. I carried them out to the balcony, where Patricia was already standing, her hands resting on the cool stone balustrade as she gazed out at the endless horizon. I handed her a glass and stood beside her, letting the fading sunlight warm my face. We raised our glasses in a silent, meaningful toast to the reclaiming of our lives. The wine tasted like absolute victory. It was rich, complex, and unhurried. As I took a slow, deliberate sip, my mind drifted back to the sprawling estate in Lake Forest. By my calculations, it was currently mid-morning in Chicago. Vanessa would be waking up from her beauty sleep, expecting to walk down her grand marble staircase to the smell of roasting meats and simmering sauces. She would expect to find my wife slaving over a hot stove, rendering herself invisible for the sake of an aesthetic dinner party. The immense satisfaction I felt was not born of malice, but of a deeply calibrated sense of justice. The trap was holding perfectly steady. We stood there on the balcony, thousands of miles away from the epicenter of the impending disaster, completely insulated from the blast radius. I checked my watch, watching the second hand sweep in a smooth, continuous circle. The countdown was quietly ticking away, leading inevitably toward the moment the illusion would shatter, and I felt nothing but a profound, unshakable peace. The Mediterranean sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving a canvas of deep violet and bruised indigo across the Italian sky. Patricia and I sat on the stone balcony of our remote villa, wrapped in the thick woven blankets provided by our host. The air was crisp and smelled of ancient sea salt and distant wood smoke. We were thousands of miles away from the frozen, manicured lawns of Lake Forest, but the true distance was measured in the profound, unshakable stillness of our minds. I held the delicate crystal glass of vintage Barolo, letting the heavy, dark red liquid breathe in the cool night air. The silence was absolute and incredibly healing. It was the kind of deep quiet that only belongs to people who have finally stopped running a punishing race they never agreed to enter. The rustic wooden table between us held nothing but a small plate of local olives and my mobile phone, which sat face down like a dormant bomb. I knew the exact mathematical trajectory of the evening currently occurring back in Chicago. I knew that at this precise moment, the polished mahogany doors of Connor's estate were opening to admit a flood of wealthy, influential guests. I knew the trap was springing shut. The peaceful evening was abruptly shattered by the violent mechanical buzzing of my phone vibrating against the hard wood. The aggressive noise rattled the empty water glasses and sliced right through the tranquil Mediterranean night. Patricia stiffened slightly, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The old toxic conditioning was deeply ingrained in her bones. For years, a ringing phone at this specific hour meant a catering emergency or a sudden ungrateful demand from a daughter-in-law who viewed us as personal property. I placed my wineglass down with deliberate slowness and reached for the device. The glowing screen illuminated the darkness, displaying Vanessa's name in bright, glaring letters. I did not feel a sudden spike of anxiety or the familiar, exhausting dread of impending conflict. I felt the cold, clinical anticipation of a structural engineer watching a condemned building finally begin to buckle under its own rotten weight. I swiped the screen to accept the call and pressed the cold glass to my ear without saying a single word. Vanessa did not bother with a polite greeting or any standard preamble. Her voice exploded through the small speaker as a chaotic, frantic shriek that completely lacked her usual aristocratic polish. She was screaming hysterically about the grand dining room and the 30 impeccably dressed guests currently sitting around her massive empty table. She demanded to know where Patricia was hiding. She vividly described the horrific social humiliation unfolding in real time. The elite venture capitalists and the country club presidents and the neighborhood influencers were sitting in their tailored suits and expensive designer dresses, staring blankly at completely empty imported porcelain plates. There was no roasted turkey resting on the silver platter. There were no artisan side dishes warming in the ovens. The sprawling gourmet kitchen was completely dark and sterile, smelling only of expensive cleaning supplies instead of a magnificent holiday feast. She shrieked that she had found my yellow sticky note on the front door, and she loudly accused us of orchestrating a malicious, childish prank to ruin her flawless social reputation. The sheer arrogance of her panic was a spectacular thing to witness. Even in the face of total abandonment, Vanessa remained firmly trapped in her absolute delusion of control. She did not ask why we had left or if we were safe. She immediately pivoted to barking desperate, tyrannical orders. She commanded me to put Patricia on the line instantly. She demanded that we immediately contact an exclusive downtown catering service and secure a full traditional holiday feast, regardless of the exorbitant emergency holiday pricing. She yelled that we needed to fix this catastrophic disaster within the hour, or she would never allow us to set foot in her home or speak to our son ever again. She wielded the threat of family excommunication like a heavy club, completely oblivious to the fact that we had already willingly severed the chains ourselves. She ranted about the whispering guests in her foyer and the profound, unbearable embarrassment of offering vintage champagne with absolutely nothing to serve alongside it. She was suffocating under the crushing weight of her own manufactured social expectations, and she expected us to save her. I allowed her to scream until she literally ran out of breath. I listened to the ragged, frantic panting echoing through the transatlantic receiver. I did not interrupt her unhinged tirade or offer a single word of defense or explanation. I simply reached across the table, picked up my crystal glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the Barolo. The wine was rich and earthy, grounding me entirely in the present moment. I swallowed the heavy red liquid and let the cold silence stretch across the connection. I waited patiently until the absolute terror of my silence began to penetrate her frantic, spinning mind. I finally spoke, keeping my voice incredibly low, perfectly even, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. I asked her a very simple, logistical question. I asked her exactly how she expected a woman currently sitting on a stone balcony overlooking the Mediterranean Sea in Florence, Italy, to baste a turkey in a suburban Chicago kitchen. The silence that followed my question was total and absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding to a violent halt inside her brain. The geographical reality of my statement struck her with the force of a physical blow. The concept that her invisible servants had not simply gone to the local market or retreated to their modest suburban home, but had actually fled the continent entirely, was impossible for her arrogant mind to immediately process. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath as the grand illusion of her supremacy finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She stammered a broken, confused question, asking why we were in Italy. The aristocratic venom had completely vanished from her tone, replaced by the small, trembling voice of a woman who suddenly realized she was standing on a trapdoor that had just swung open. I felt Patricia watching me intently in the dark, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and final beautiful release. I did not allow Vanessa any time to recover her composure. I maintained my clinical detachment and delivered the final crushing sequence of events. I informed her that the lack of a holiday feast was the absolute least of her current problems. I advised her to stop worrying about the empty porcelain plates and to start worrying about the heavy manila envelope that was scheduled to arrive at her front door at any moment. I told her that the massive commercial credit lines funding her leased luxury vehicles and her imported marble floors and her exotic vacations had been permanently and legally severed. I explained that the estate she was currently standing in belonged entirely to a holding company I controlled, and the 30-day eviction notice she was about to receive was completely non-negotiable. I suggested she march into the dining room and ask her brilliant husband why he thought he could successfully embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own father without ever facing a consequence. I told her that the plastic credit cards currently sitting in her designer purse were now completely worthless, and her reign of tyrannical entitlement was officially terminated. I did not wait for her response. I did not want to hear the inevitable denial or the desperate panicked bargaining or the final pathetic attempts at emotional manipulation. I simply removed the phone from my ear and pressed the red button severing the connection permanently. I placed the device back on the rustic wooden table and pressed the power button, holding it down firmly until the screen went completely black. The digital tether to our miserable past life was officially extinguished. The Mediterranean night immediately rushed back in to fill the silence. The rhythmic sound of the crashing waves below and the gentle rustling of the lemon trees in the cool breeze washed over the balcony. I looked across the table at my wife. Patricia reached out and picked up her own glass of wine. Her hands were perfectly still. She raised the crystal toward me, and we touched our glasses together in the dark. The delicate chime of the crystal was the only sound we needed. We sat back in our chairs, drinking our wine and breathing the clean Italian air, knowing that an ocean away, a fraudulent empire was burning to the ground, while we were finally safely and completely at peace. The silence that had settled over the stone balcony was profoundly beautiful, but I knew it would be brief. The digital screen of my phone remained black for exactly 40 seconds before it lit up again, violently vibrating against the rustic wooden table. The caller identification displayed my son's personal cellular number. The frantic, desperate energy of his wife had clearly failed to yield the desired results, and now the master of the house felt compelled to intervene. I let the phone vibrate 3 distinct times, allowing the Mediterranean sea breeze to cool my face before I reached out and accepted the call. I brought the cold glass to my ear, and I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the transatlantic connection. Connor did not begin the conversation with a question. He bypassed any attempt to understand the situation and launched immediately into a furious, deafening roar of absolute entitlement. He had snatched the phone directly from his wife, and he was wielding his voice like a blunt instrument, trying to batter me into submission through sheer volume. He screamed that my actions were the pathetic, desperate maneuvers of a bitter old man who was jealous of his own son's magnificent success. He shouted that abandoning them on the day of their most important social event was an unforgivable betrayal that would have permanent, devastating consequences. He promised with a voice trembling with raw, unadulterated rage that he was banishing me from his life completely. He swore that I would never be allowed to set foot inside his estate again. He threatened that I would never see any future grandchildren, and that Patricia and I would die alone in our miserable suburban mediocrity, entirely cut off from the brilliant legacy he was building. He was attempting to deploy the ultimate weapon of an abusive child, which is the absolute withdrawal of affection and access. He fundamentally believed that the threat of his absence would bring me begging to my knees. I sat perfectly still in my chair, holding the crystal glass of Barolo in my free hand. I listened to the frantic echo of his voice traveling across the ocean, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no parental heartbreak, and there was no instinct to comfort the angry boy on the line. I was merely a structural engineer observing a man standing on a condemned bridge blindly jumping up and down and demanding that the steel beams support his weight. When his tirade finally ran out of momentum, leaving him gasping for air into the receiver, I took a slow, deliberate breath. I did not match his frantic energy. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with a quiet surgical precision that cut directly through the static of his emotional manipulation. I told Connor that his threat of banishment was entirely unnecessary because I had already permanently severed the connection myself. I advised him to stop screaming about holiday dinners and social events because the appetizers missing from his dining room table were the absolute least of his impending catastrophic problems. I heard him scoff a harsh, dismissive sound, but I did not pause to allow him to speak. I informed him that exactly 8 hours ago, my wealth manager, Warren Becker, had executed a series of irrevocable legal directives. I stated clearly and methodically that the master commercial credit line funding his entire venture capital firm had been permanently frozen. I explained that the corporate accounts were completely locked down, and every single business credit card bearing his name would be instantly declined across the global financial network. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and absolute. The roaring fury that had fueled his entire existence just moments ago vanished as if someone had cut the oxygen supply to a raging fire. I could hear the exact moment his brain attempted to process the impossibility of my words. He stammered a weak, confused question, demanding to know what right I had to interfere with his corporate operations. He was still trying to cling to the grand illusion of his independent success. I dismantled that illusion with brutal, undeniable facts. I told him that I possessed the absolute legal right to freeze the accounts because I was the primary guarantor of the capital, and he had committed systematic, calculated commercial fraud. I let the word fraud hang heavily in the transatlantic air, ensuring he felt the full, devastating weight of the criminal implication. I detailed the exact findings of my forensic audit. I recited the specific dates and the precise exorbitant dollar amounts of the transfers he had fraudulently authorized. I named the exclusive resorts in the Maldives. I listed the phantom business development expenses that had funded Vanessa's designer wardrobe. I explicitly identified the hidden offshore accounts where he had been quietly siphoning my retirement capital, preparing for his inevitable failure. I told him that I possessed the digital signature logs proving he had personally authorized the embezzlement of over $400,000 from a federally insured commercial line of credit. Connor attempted to interrupt, but his voice was no longer a roar. It was a high-pitched, desperate squeak. He tried to claim that the transfers were legitimate operational loans and that he was planning to repay the master account after his next round of investor funding. He tried to spin a complex web of financial jargon to confuse the old man he believed me to be. I shut down his pathetic bargaining instantly. I informed him that Warren Becker had officially classified the diverted funds as unauthorized personal theft, thereby completely piercing the protective veil of his limited liability corporation. I explained the grim reality of his new existence. The massive, crushing debt was no longer a corporate problem shielded by bankruptcy laws. It was his direct personal liability. The bank would be demanding immediate full repayment, and his personal assets would be seized to satisfy the massive deficit he had arrogantly created. The psychological shift happening across the ocean was palpable. The rage had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, suffocating panic. The leverage had entirely flipped. He was no longer the brilliant master of the universe dictating terms to his naive elderly father. He was a terrified, exposed fraud, realizing that his entire luxurious life was a house of cards built over a massive sinkhole. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He asked in a small, trembling voice how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He tried to weaponize my paternal duty, asking how I could destroy his reputation and leave him entirely destitute on a holiday meant for family. I took another slow sip of my wine, tasting the dark, rich fruit and feeling the cool ocean breeze brush against my collar. I answered him with the cold, uncompromising truth. I told him that I had not destroyed his life. He had systematically dismantled it himself with every fraudulent invoice he signed and every cruel, condescending remark his wife delivered to my wife while he stood by, in silent, complicit approval. I reminded him that true power does not reside in leased luxury vehicles or imported marble floors. True power resides in ownership and truth, and he owned absolutely nothing. I told him that the financial umbilical cord that had sustained his arrogant, parasitic lifestyle for the past 5 years was now permanently and irreversibly severed. I advised him to go back into his grand dining room, look his wealthy investors in the eye, and explain exactly why the brilliant venture capitalist could no longer afford to feed them. Connor began to beg. The sound was pathetic and entirely devoid of dignity. He pleaded for a second chance, promising to restructure the firm, promising to make Vanessa apologize to his mother, promising to dedicate his life to repaying the stolen funds. He was willing to sacrifice his pride, his wife, and his illusions just to keep the money flowing. It was the final confirmation that I was absolutely right to destroy the structure. I told him that apologies purchased with the threat of bankruptcy are completely worthless. I told him that my money was no longer available to finance his redemption or his ruin. He would have to navigate the consequences of his actions entirely on his own, without the safety net he had spent years actively sabotaging. I did not wait for his final desperate plea. I did not say goodbye or offer a single word of familial comfort. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the screen terminating the call. The silence of the Italian night immediately reclaimed the space washing over the balcony like a cleansing tide. I turned my phone off completely, ensuring that no further frantic messages or tearful voicemails could penetrate our sanctuary. I looked across the table at Patricia. She was watching me with a profound, quiet strength. The heavy burden of raising a child who had chosen greed over love had finally been lifted from our shoulders. We were thousands of miles away from the chaos, and for the first time in our lives, we belonged entirely to ourselves. The grand dining room of the Lake Forest estate was a meticulously curated masterpiece of hollow aesthetics and arrogant ambition. 30 polished crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light of the massive cascading chandelier, but they remained completely empty. The long custom mahogany table was set with imported silk runners and heavy antique silver cutlery, but the total absence of food created a suffocating, anxious void in the center of the opulent room. The wealthy investors, the elite country club presidents, and the influential neighborhood socialites shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed velvet dining chairs. They were a class of people entirely accustomed to immediate abundance and flawless service. The sterile scent of expensive floral centerpieces, instead of the rich, comforting aroma of roasted meats, made them increasingly restless and suspicious. Connor stood near the towering marble fireplace wearing a tailored bespoke suit that suddenly felt entirely too tight and restrictive. He clutched a heavy glass of expensive scotch, attempting to project an aura of relaxed executive confidence, but a cold, damp sweat had already begun to form at his temples. He offered empty, repetitive platitudes about a minor logistical delay with their exclusive private chef. His primary investors exchanged subtle, highly judgmental glances across the empty table. In the brutal, unforgiving world of high finance, a man who could not manage the logistics of a simple holiday dinner was a man who absolutely could not be trusted to manage millions in venture capital. In the sprawling gourmet kitchen, Vanessa paced frantically across the imported Italian floor tiles, like a desperate trapped animal. Her designer silk gown rustled sharply in the pristine, agonizing quiet of the vast culinary space. She stared intensely at the bright yellow sticky note that she had found plastered to her front door just hours earlier. The handwritten message from me burned in her mind, mocking her absolute lack of control over the situation. She had spent the entire afternoon frantically calling every single high-end catering service and luxury restaurant in the greater Chicago area, demanding immediate service and offering ridiculous, exorbitant sums of money. Every single desperate call had ended in a polite but incredibly firm refusal. It was Thanksgiving evening, and her immense stolen wealth could not buy her a miraculous last-minute salvation. She gripped the edge of the massive marble island until her knuckles turned a stark bone white. She could hear the low, impatient, and highly critical murmur of her elite guests echoing down the long corridor. The very people she had spent 5 years desperately trying to impress and dominate were currently sitting in her home witnessing her ultimate and undeniable social failure. She smoothed her hair with trembling hands, took a deep, ragged breath, and prepared to walk back into the dining room to offer another fabricated, desperate excuse. Before she could take a single step toward the hallway, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly through the massive foyer. The sound cut through the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the house like a sharp, heavy blade. A sudden, overwhelming wave of intense, euphoric relief washed over Vanessa. She immediately assumed that her aggressive, persistent bargaining had finally worked, and a desperate, highly paid catering company had arrived to save her flawless evening from total ruin. She practically ran down the corridor, her expensive high heels clicking rapidly and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floors. Connor stepped out of the formal dining room, joining his wife in the grand entryway with a look of desperate hope. The 30 elite guests paused their hushed, critical conversations and turned their attention entirely toward the heavy mahogany front door, anticipating the long overdue arrival of a lavish holiday feast. Vanessa reached out and pulled the massive, heavy door open with a triumphant, relieved smile already forming on her lips. She prepared to quietly usher the service staff toward the kitchen and seamlessly resume her role as the perfect, untouchable, aristocratic hostess. The man standing on the front porch was not holding covered silver platters or insulated warming bags. He was dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, and he held a heavy leather legal briefcase. He possessed the rigid, uncompromising posture of a man who dealt exclusively in absolute, unyielding legal realities. He stepped forward directly into the warm, bright light of the grand foyer, bringing a blast of freezing Chicago wind with him. He did not lower his voice or attempt to maintain any sense of quiet, polite discretion. He asked clearly and firmly for Connor and Vanessa, confirming their legal identities with a cold, mechanical precision. Connor took a hesitant, terrified step forward, his glass of scotch trembling visibly in his tight grip. He told the man that this was a private residence during a private social event and demanded to know exactly what business he had interrupting them. The process server simply unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and reached inside with absolute calm. He pulled out 2 thick, heavy manila envelopes. They were the exact envelopes Warren Becker had meticulously prepared and sealed in his downtown financial office just hours ago. The man stepped completely over the threshold and placed the heavy packages directly into Connor and Vanessa's reluctant, shaking hands. The man in the charcoal suit did not simply turn and walk away into the night. He was a seasoned professional, instructed to ensure absolute legal compliance, and he performed his duty with devastating public clarity. He announced to the entire silent, breathless room that the envelopes contained formal and immediate eviction notices for the premises. He stated clearly that the sprawling estate was entirely owned by a corporate holding company, and they had exactly 30 days to vacate the property, hand over all sets of keys, and leave or face immediate physical removal by county law enforcement. A collective, heavy gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of elite socialites. The country club presidents and the wealthy corporate investors stared in absolute, unblinking shock. But the process server was not finished delivering the architectured ruin. He turned his attention specifically to Connor, and his voice carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a judge delivering a final, devastating sentence. He formally notified my son that he was being served with comprehensive civil litigation for severe corporate fraud and the systematic, intentional embezzlement of commercial funds. He stated with absolute clarity that all associated operational credit lines and venture capital accounts had been completely and permanently frozen by executive order. The silence that descended upon the grand foyer was heavier and more suffocating than wet concrete. The process server turned around and walked back out into the freezing dark, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind him with a final resonant, echoing click. Connor stood completely frozen to the floor, clutching the thick manila envelope as if it were a highly venomous snake. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified child who had just been caught in a massive lie. The grand illusion of his independent wealth and his brilliant, untouchable financial acumen shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces right there on the imported silk rugs. The powerful venture capitalists he had spent years aggressively courting and impressing were no longer looking at an arrogant financial prodigy. They were looking at a desperate, exposed, and utterly ruined fraud who had just been publicly accused of stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own father. The very foundation of his professional reputation evaporated in a matter of seconds. He was entirely financially toxic, and every single investor in the room instantly recognized the severe liability of his presence. Vanessa stood beside him, completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing magnitude of her immediate social destruction. She slowly looked down at the heavy legal documents resting in her trembling hands. The 30 days' notice to vacate the premises was printed in stark, undeniable black ink. The multi-million-dollar mansion she had routinely used to humiliate my wife and artificially elevate her own social status was officially and undeniably slipping right through her manicured fingers. She slowly raised her heavy head and looked at the faces of her 30 gathered guests. The people she considered her absolute peers were already beginning to take slow, deliberate steps away from her. The whispers started instantly filling the foyer. They were low, venomous murmurs of pure scandal and utter unforgiving disdain. The elite competitive circle she worshipped was incredibly cruel and entirely unforgiving of public humiliation and sudden financial ruin. The guests began to gather their expensive wool coats and their designer leather bags, moving swiftly and silently toward the grand exit. They did not offer any warm words of comfort or hollow promises of future support. They simply wanted to escape the immediate blast radius of a violently collapsing empire. Within 10 agonizing minutes, the grand dining room was completely empty and silent. The imported silk runners and the delicate crystal wine glasses sat entirely abandoned, reflecting the harsh light of the chandelier. Connor dropped his heavy glass of scotch onto the floor, watching the amber liquid spill and the crystal shatter against the polished hardwood. He frantically tore open the manila envelope, and his wide, panicked eyes scanned the complex legal documents that Warren Becker had so meticulously drafted. He saw the highly specific itemized lists of his fraudulent transfers, the detailed luxury resort expenses, and the completely frozen offshore accounts. He realized with a cold, suffocating dread that I had secured every single piece of damning financial evidence before I ever boarded a plane. I had not left him a single hidden avenue of escape or any room for negotiation. The commercial operational credit lines were entirely gone. His personal borrowing power was legally and permanently destroyed. His social standing within the city was completely and utterly obliterated. He was trapped inside a massive freezing mansion with absolutely no food, no operational money, and absolutely no viable future. Vanessa slowly sank down onto the bottom step of her grand, sweeping marble staircase. The expensive designer silk gown pooled around her on the cold, unforgiving stone. She buried her face deep in her hands and let out a long, wretched, devastating sob that echoed loudly through the empty, echoing halls. She had spent 5 years treating Patricia like a completely disposable servant, totally blind to the fact that her entire lavish, aristocratic existence depended entirely on the quiet, enduring grace of the very people she constantly abused. Now the invisible, sturdy foundation had been violently and surgically removed, and she was left sitting helplessly in the absolute rubble of her own arrogance. Connor leaned heavily against the hallway wall, staring blankly at the ruined, abandoned Thanksgiving table. He understood with absolute agonizing clarity that the weapon of his destruction had not been handed to me by an outside malicious force. He had carefully and intentionally forged the devastating blade himself and simply handed it directly to a structural engineer who knew exactly where to strike to ensure a total collapse. The financial umbilical cord was permanently and legally severed, and the heavy silence filling the dark house was the undeniable sound of complete, absolute ruin. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind the last departing guest, leaving an immense ringing silence in the grand foyer. It was a silence so absolute and heavy that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the imported marble floors. Just 30 minutes prior, the house had hummed with the vibrant energy of Chicago's financial elite. Now the space was completely hollow. The quiet excuses and the averted eyes of the venture capitalists and country club executives had been far more devastating than any shouted insult. They had treated the mansion like a sinking ship, stepping briskly out into the freezing November night and refusing to look back. Connor stood perfectly still in the center of the foyer. The thick manila envelope delivered by the process server lay discarded at his feet like a piece of toxic waste. The reality of his situation had not fully penetrated his panicked mind. He operated under the lifelong assumption that a simple phone call or a cleverly spun lie could fix any crisis. He pulled his mobile phone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His hands trembled so violently that he nearly dropped the sleek device onto the hard stone floor. He tapped the screen and opened the primary application for his private banking institution. The facial recognition software scanned his terrified features and granted him access to his digital dashboard. The screen loaded for a brief, agonizing second before the numbers materialized in stark, uncompromising black and white. The master checking account connected to his venture capital firm displayed a catastrophic error message. The words, "Account Frozen Contact Administrator," glowed in bright red text. He frantically swiped his thumb across the glass screen, navigating to the corporate operational reserves. The balance was absolutely zero. He felt a cold, suffocating sweat break out across his forehead. He toggled to his personal wealth management portfolio, the one he used to fund his extravagant lifestyle and pay for the endless stream of luxury goods. Access denied. The words mocked him. Every single financial artery tying him to his illusion of wealth had been surgically clamped shut. He tried to transfer a meager sum from a secondary savings account to his primary debit card. The transaction was instantly declined due to a pending legal hold. He pulled up the mobile application for his platinum credit card, the same card he had used just yesterday to secure a private cabana in the Maldives. The available credit limit read 0. The card had been canceled by the issuer due to flagged fraudulent activity linked to the corporate embezzlement charges. He was a man accustomed to moving hundreds of thousands of dollars with a casual flick of his wrist, and now he did not possess the digital liquidity to purchase a single cup of coffee. He stared at the glowing rectangle in his hands, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that his father had not delivered an empty threat. The financial execution was flawless, comprehensive, and entirely complete. Vanessa stood a few feet away, watching her husband rapidly unravel. Her expensive silk gown felt completely out of place in the suddenly freezing house. The sophisticated charm she utilized to manipulate her social circle had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a raw, desperate panic. She looked down at the scattered legal documents resting on the pristine floor. She slowly crouched down, picking up the thick stack of papers detailing the eviction notice and the civil fraud litigation. She read the stark legal language outlining the true ownership of the Lake Forest estate. The holding company, controlled entirely by her father-in-law, possessed the absolute unyielding deed to the property. The truth washed over her like a bucket of freezing water. The sprawling mansion she proudly displayed to her friends did not belong to her husband. The luxury vehicles parked in the heated garage were leased through the now-defunct corporate account. The extravagant lifestyle she had lorded over Patricia was entirely funded by the very people she treated as disposable servants. She realized with a sickening sinking sensation in her stomach that she had not married a brilliant financial titan. She had married a parasitic fraud who was actively stealing from his own parents to maintain a pathetic illusion. The superiority she felt over her peers was a complete and utter mirage. She possessed absolutely no equity and no true assets. Vanessa looked up from the papers, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden visceral disgust. She demanded that Connor explain the documents. She ordered him to fix the frozen accounts and restore her access to the funds immediately. Her voice was shrill and demanding, entirely lacking the sweet melodic tone she used when everything was going her way. Connor finally lifted his gaze from his useless phone. The arrogant swagger that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone. He looked at his wife, and for the first time he had absolutely no clever lie to offer. He told her the money was gone. He explained that his father had audited the offshore ledgers and discovered the diverted capital. He confessed that the bank was preparing to seize their personal belongings to satisfy the massive commercial debt. The alliance between them, built entirely on the fragile foundation of endless stolen wealth, fractured instantly. Vanessa shrieked that she would not be publicly humiliated or dragged down into bankruptcy because of his idiotic incompetence. She paced the length of the empty foyer, yelling that her reputation was permanently destroyed and that she could never show her face at the country club again. She blamed him for being reckless and careless, entirely omitting her own endless demands for designer clothes and exotic vacations that had drained the accounts in the first place. Connor shouted back, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He blamed her insatiable vanity for forcing him to embezzle the funds. He screamed that he only stole the money to keep her happy and to maintain the ridiculous aristocratic standards she demanded. The massive empty house echoed with their bitter, venomous accusations. Without the cushion of limitless money to insulate them from their own toxic personalities, they quickly turned into vicious enemies. They stood in the center of their ruined kingdom, tearing each other apart, while the reality of their destitute future closed in around them. There was no inherited wealth waiting to save them. There was no forgiving father ready to write a blank check to cover their mistakes. There was no quiet mother preparing an elegant feast to distract them from their failures. Connor walked away from his screaming wife and wandered aimlessly into the grand formal dining room. The 30 empty crystal wine glasses sat perfectly aligned on the long mahogany table. The imported silk runners stretched across the wood, completely devoid of food. His stomach growled loudly, a stark physical reminder of the holiday dinner that would never arrive. He walked through the swinging doors into the massive gourmet kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed in the dim light, perfectly clean and entirely unused. The commercial-grade refrigerators were completely empty, save for a few bottles of imported sparkling water. He opened the custom cabinetry, finding nothing but expensive, decorative serving platters. He walked back out to the foyer, where Vanessa had collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand marble staircase. She was sobbing quietly into her hands, mourning the social death she had just suffered. Connor realized that he had spent his entire life looking down on his father, dismissing him as a rigid, uninspired relic of the past. He had foolishly believed that his slick vocabulary and tailored suits made him a superior man. He now understood the devastating difference between looking powerful and actually possessing power. His father held the absolute unyielding power of truth and ownership. Connor owned nothing but a mountain of fraudulent debt and a 30-day eviction notice. The freezing Chicago wind howled violently against the tall glass windows of the mansion, rattling the heavy panes. The estate felt less like a luxurious palace and more like a massive gilded cage. They were entirely trapped in a prison of their own making. Connor sat down on the cold floor across from his weeping wife. The utter silence of the house pressed against his eardrums. There were no caterers rushing to save the evening. There were no investors waiting to fund his next fake venture. There was no one left to manipulate, and absolutely no one left to exploit. They were forced to sit in the cold, unyielding reality of their own ruin, waiting for the inevitable moment the bank would arrive to take whatever little they had left. The illusion was completely shattered, leaving only the brutal, quiet consequence of their boundless greed. The collapse of Connor's meticulously constructed world was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. There was no prolonged negotiation and no dramatic period of mourning for the life he had lost. The total evaporation of his stolen wealth acted as a perfect solvent, dissolving the fragile bonds of his marriage in a matter of days. Vanessa did not wait for the moving trucks to arrive or for the bank examiners to catalog the furniture. The very morning the eviction notice became legally binding, she simply packed her extensive collection of designer luggage and walked out the front door. She did not shed a single tear or offer a word of comfort to the man she had sworn to stand by. Her departure was entirely transactional and devoid of any genuine emotional connection. She had married a balance sheet and a social status, and the moment those assets were frozen, her commitment was permanently terminated. She hailed a private car service to take her to a luxury hotel downtown, leaving Connor completely alone in the massive freezing estate to face the devastating consequences of their combined greed. The heavy silence of the empty mansion echoed around him, serving as a constant reminder of his total isolation. I felt a cold sense of validation, knowing that the woman who had treated my wife with such profound cruelty was now forced to scramble for a new source of unearned wealth. Connor was forced to vacate the Lake Forest property just before the first heavy snow of the winter. He did not have the funds to hire a professional moving company or a team of decorators to perfectly arrange his new life. He packed his remaining clothes into cardboard boxes and loaded them into a rented commercial van. The transition from the sprawling, opulent estate to his new reality was a harsh sensory shock. He relocated to a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the far opposite side of the city. The building was a towering concrete structure filled with the relentless sounds of struggling humanity. The walls of his small unit were incredibly thin, offering absolutely no insulation from the constant arguments of his neighbors or the heavy rumble of the elevated train tracks just 2 streets over. The air in the narrow hallways always smelled of cheap industrial cleaning fluid and stale cooking oil. It was a staggering departure from the scent of fresh-cut flowers and imported leather he had grown so accustomed to. He had to carry his boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the service elevator was perpetually broken. He sat on a cheap second-hand mattress in the center of his tiny living room, listening to the sirens wailing in the distance. The single small window in his bedroom looked out over a desolate alleyway filled with overflowing dumpsters. The vast echo of his former dining room was replaced by the suffocating confinement of a space that forced him to confront his absolute failure every single minute of the day. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed violently throughout the night, denying him even the basic comfort of a peaceful sleep. The sheer terror of facing federal fraud charges and the looming threat of criminal prosecution forced Connor to make choices he would have previously considered entirely beneath him. He knew that I held the digital evidence of his commercial embezzlement, and he understood that his only viable path to avoiding a prison sentence was to secure immediate legitimate employment to begin satisfying the massive debts he had accumulated. The elite venture capital firms and the prestigious investment banks completely ignored his desperate applications. His professional reputation was entirely toxic, and no financial institution would risk associating with a man under investigation for corporate theft. He was eventually forced to accept a grueling entry-level management position at a regional logistics facility. It was a punishing, unforgiving environment that demanded 10-hour shifts of intense physical and mental labor. He was required to wake up hours before dawn and commute through the freezing city traffic to a massive gray warehouse. He spent his days wearing a cheap synthetic uniform, tracking inventory metrics, and taking direct orders from regional supervisors he once would have openly mocked at his country club. The bright fluorescent lights of the warehouse illuminated his exhaustion and the stark reality of his new standing in the world. He ate his lunch in a bleak concrete break room, surrounded by exhausted workers who had no interest in his former title or his past wealth. The work was absolutely draining, stripping away every ounce of his energy and leaving him with rough, calloused hands and a perpetually aching back. He returned to his noisy apartment each evening, far too exhausted to even consider his former life of luxury. The profound arrogance that had defined Connor for his entire adult life was systematically erased by the harsh, unrelenting reality of pure survival. He no longer had the energy or the financial leverage to look down on the working class because he was now firmly entrenched within it. The expensive tailored suits were replaced by practical, durable clothing meant to withstand the punishing winter winds and the dirt of the warehouse floor. When he walked down the street, he no longer carried the inflated swagger of a financial titan. He walked with the heavy measured steps of a man carrying the massive weight of his own terrible choices. I received brief, periodic updates regarding his status from my legal representatives, but I did not reach out to him. The absolute silence between us was the final necessary boundary. He was finally learning the foundational lessons of respect and accountability that my boundless generosity had previously prevented him from understanding. The painful, grueling existence he now navigated was not a cruel punishment inflicted by a vindictive father. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of a life built entirely on deceit and theft. The fraudulent empire was gone, and in its place was the quiet, steady rhythm of a man finally learning how to pay his own way. The flight back to Chicago was entirely different from our desperate departure just a few weeks prior. Patricia and I sat in the quiet cabin watching the vast ocean pass beneath us, but we were no longer fleeing from a disaster. We were returning as entirely new people. The Mediterranean sun had baked the chronic anxiety out of our bones, and the sheer physical distance had given us the absolute clarity we so desperately needed. When the heavy aircraft finally descended through the thick gray winter clouds of Illinois, I did not feel the familiar knot of dread forming in my chest. I looked at my wife and saw a woman who had completely reclaimed her dignity. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her eyes held a calm, steady light that I had not seen in over a decade. We stepped out of the terminal and into the biting winter wind, but the cold no longer possessed the power to reach us. We carried an impenetrable warmth with us, forged in the quiet realization that we belonged entirely to ourselves again. The very next morning, we walked into the sleek downtown office of Warren Becker. The towering glass building overlooked the bustling financial district, but our focus was entirely on the heavy mahogany desk and the crisp white legal documents waiting for our signatures. There was no hesitation or lingering guilt in the room. I picked up the heavy brass pen and officially placed the sprawling Lake Forest estate on the open real estate market. I signed the listing agreement with a smooth, continuous motion, watching the black ink seal the fate of the mansion that had once been a monument to our endless sacrifices. We were liquidating the physical manifestation of the boundless greed of our son. The real estate agent, a sharp, professional woman, assured us the property would sell quickly, given its prime location and exorbitant features. I felt a profound, immense satisfaction knowing that the marble floors and the grand dining room where we had been so ruthlessly humiliated would soon belong to complete strangers. The illusion of the aristocratic empire of Connor was officially transformed into a simple commercial transaction. We did not stop at simply liquidating the property. We spent the remainder of the afternoon completely restructuring our entire financial legacy. Warren Becker carefully outlined the parameters of a massive, irrevocable trust. Patricia and I sat side by side, moving our entire accumulated wealth into a locked charitable foundation dedicated to supporting vulnerable elderly citizens. We redirected the millions of dollars that were originally intended to serve as a generous inheritance for a son who had proven himself entirely unworthy of the gift. The legal language was completely airtight, and the transfer was absolutely permanent. The charitable trust would be managed by a board of independent directors, ensuring that the funds would directly benefit those who truly needed assistance. Connor would never be able to access a single penny of our life savings ever again. He could not contest the documents or claim mental incompetence because we had proactively secured comprehensive medical evaluations, proving our absolute cognitive clarity. The financial umbilical cord that had sustained his toxic, parasitic lifestyle was not just cut, but entirely incinerated. As I signed the final page of the trust agreement, I felt a massive, heavy chain fall away from my soul. We were no longer hostage to the desperate hope that our generosity would eventually purchase the genuine love of our child. Our wealth was now a tool for actual good rather than a weapon used against us by our own family. With our financial affairs perfectly secured, We returned to our own modest suburban home to begin the physical purging of our past. For years, we had slowly altered our living space to accommodate the pretentious tastes of a daughter-in-law who despised us. We had purchased expensive, uncomfortable furniture and decorated the walls with sterile modern art just to avoid her relentless, condescending criticism. That era was officially over. Patricia and I spent the entire weekend tearing through the house with a joyful, fierce energy. We hauled the heavy, pretentious velvet chairs out to the curb. We stripped the dark, oppressive curtains from the windows and let the bright winter sunlight flood into the rooms. We packed away every single object that carried the toxic residue of our previous obligations and donated them to a local shelter. We threw away the expensive crystal glasses we had bought specifically for the rare occasions our son decided to visit. The physical labor was incredibly exhausting, but it was immensely, deeply satisfying. Every object we removed felt like a physical weight being lifted from our daily lives. We were erasing the years of silent humiliation and replacing them with a bright, welcoming emptiness. We hired local contractors to repaint the walls in warm, soft colors that reflected our own personal taste, rather than the cold aesthetic demanded by Vanessa. We purchased comfortable, simple furniture designed for actual living, rather than for shallow social posturing. The small house slowly transformed from a tense waiting room into a genuine, authentic sanctuary. We reclaimed the space entirely for ourselves, filling it with the simple, honest things that brought us actual joy. We placed our old, cherished photographs back on the mantel and filled the kitchen with the rich, comforting aroma of the food we actually liked to eat. The house no longer felt like a place where we had to carefully navigate the emotional landmines of ungrateful children. It was a clean, quiet slate where we could finally breathe without the suffocating presence of judgment and expectation. A week later, Patricia and I sat together at our small wooden kitchen table, drinking hot, dark coffee and watching the morning light filter through the bare trees outside. The house was completely silent, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty mansion. It was the rich, vibrant quiet of a life perfectly lived on its own terms. There were no frantic phone calls demanding money, and no elegant dinner parties requiring invisible labor. We had successfully stripped away the lies, the manipulation, and the endless, exhausting performance. I looked across the table at my wife and realized we had finally discovered the true definition of wealth. It was not measured in imported marble or offshore bank accounts. It was measured in the absolute, unshakable peace we now shared and the profound mutual respect that anchored our days. We had lost a son to his own boundless greed, but we had successfully saved each other, and that victory was worth absolutely everything. Exactly 365 days had passed since the absolute destruction of our former lives. The late November sun cast a warm golden light through the frosted window panes of our newly renovated kitchen. The space was completely unrecognizable from the dark, oppressive rooms we used to inhabit. We had stripped away the heavy velvet and the pretentious antique furniture, replacing it all with simple, sturdy oak and bright, welcoming colors. Patricia stood beside me at the counter, humming a soft, familiar tune as she prepared the cranberry sauce from the handwritten recipe of her mother. The air was thick with the rich, comforting aroma of roasting sage and melted butter. There were no frantic caterers and no impossible social standards to meet. We were simply two people preparing an honest meal together. The profound stillness of the house was a daily blessing. We had spent the entire year carefully rebuilding our existence upon a foundation of absolute mutual respect and quiet tranquility. The millions of dollars that once dictated our every waking moment were safely locked away in an irrevocable trust, quietly serving the vulnerable instead of feeding a monstrous greed. The digital chime of my mobile phone broke the quiet rhythm of the kitchen. I did not feel the sudden violent spike of anxiety that used to poison my blood whenever that sound occurred. I wiped my hands on a linen towel and walked slowly to the wooden counter. The bright screen displayed the name of my son. He had not attempted to contact me in over 8 months. The last time we spoke, he was screaming threats of eternal banishment from a sinking mansion. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear, offering a simple, calm greeting. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic passing by in the background, a stark contrast to the perfectly insulated silence he used to enjoy. When Connor finally spoke, his voice was completely unrecognizable. The aristocratic arrogance and the sharp, cruel entitlement had been entirely stripped away. His voice trembled with a raw, naked vulnerability that I had not heard since he was a small, terrified child waking from a nightmare. He did not launch into a defensive tirade or attempt to shift the blame. He began to weep. The sound was broken and entirely devoid of performance. He told me that he was standing in the small kitchen of his cramped apartment, watching the snow fall against the dirty glass. He confessed that the punishing reality of the past 12 months had finally broken through his delusions. He acknowledged the absolute monster he had allowed himself to become. He spoke of the endless, grueling shifts at his management job and how the physical exhaustion had slowly cleared the toxic arrogance from his mind. He apologized for the years of silent humiliation he had forced upon his mother. He apologized for treating my lifelong sacrifices as a convenient, endless resource. He wept as he admitted that losing the money was nothing compared to the agonizing realization that he had willingly destroyed the only people who had ever truly loved him unconditionally. He was not asking for a financial rescue or a reinstatement of his corporate empire. He was simply a broken man begging for the forgiveness of his father. I stood by the window watching the winter wind strip the last remaining leaves from the oak trees in our yard. I listened to his ragged apologies and felt a profound, deep sadness for the immense pain he had to endure to finally see the truth. I spoke to him with a quiet, steady voice, validating the boy I had raised before the greed consumed him. I told him that I heard his apology and that I accepted it entirely. I told him that I loved him and that the door to my heart would never be closed to my son. But I also laid down the absolute permanent boundaries of our new reality. I explained with surgical precision that my forgiveness did not equal a return to our previous dynamic. I stated clearly that the financial trust was permanent, and the money he once coveted would never be available to him again. I told him that true rehabilitation requires walking the difficult path entirely on your own, without a safety net to catch your inevitable falls. The consequences of his actions were permanent, and he would have to build his future with his own calloused hands. Love and financial subservience were no longer connected. I told him that I respected the man he was trying to become, but that the emotional and financial distance between us was a steel boundary that would never be breached. Connor absorbed the heavy weight of my words. He did not argue or attempt to negotiate a compromise. The false superiority that once drove him had been completely burned away by the harsh reality of survival. He simply thanked me in a quiet, humbled whisper and promised that he would continue to work to become a man I could be proud of. I wished him a peaceful Thanksgiving and slowly lowered the phone, terminating the connection. I stood in the warm kitchen, processing the absolute finality of the conversation. The toxic cycle of abuse and manipulation was officially dead. I turned around and looked at Patricia. She was watching me with a soft, understanding smile, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She knew exactly what had transpired, and she knew the immense strength it took to hold the line. We did not need to speak about the darkness of the past. I walked over to the wooden dining table and picked up the carving knife. I looked at the beautiful, simple feast we had prepared with our own hands. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past was completely gone. I began to carve the turkey, knowing that the natural order of our family had finally and permanently been restored. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing Connor and Vanessa in a tomb of their own making. Connor frantically tapped the glass screen of his mobile phone. His thumb swiped with desperate, jerky movements, trying to force the digital world to bend to his will. The banking application loaded, displaying a spinning circle that felt like a countdown to his execution. The screen flashed bright white. The corporate master account showed a zero balance. The offshore reserve was locked by an administrative hold. The personal line of credit displayed a glaring red restriction notice. He refreshed the application again and again, but the numbers remained stubbornly and terrifyingly blank. Around them, the final few guests grabbed their cashmere coats from the closet, without waiting for the attendant. The silence of the departing elite was far worse than any shouted insult. They were fleeing a sinking ship, leaving behind a profound, suffocating emptiness in the grand foyer. Connor tried to call his private banker, but the call went directly to a generic automated voicemail. He realized the financial institution had already been briefed by his father. Vanessa watched the red restriction notices reflect in the terrified eyes of her husband. The carefully constructed illusion of her aristocratic superiority dissolved in an instant. She demanded an explanation with a voice that was sharp and trembling. Connor could not form a coherent sentence. He mumbled pathetic excuses about temporary freezes and bank errors, but the absolute panic radiating from his skin told the undeniable truth. Vanessa realized that the sprawling estate and the imported cars and the designer wardrobe were entirely financed by the blood and sweat of the very people she had treated as disposable servants. She remembered the day she had demanded her mother-in-law use the service entrance. That arrogance now tasted like poison. Her marriage was not a partnership of elite equals. It was a parasitic scam, and the host had just permanently cut the cord. She did not scream or throw objects. Her reaction was purely transactional. She walked up the sweeping marble staircase, retrieved her collection of expensive leather luggage, and began filling it with whatever jewelry and designer items she could carry. When she descended the stairs an hour later, she did not look at Connor. She ordered a private car service from her phone, stepped out into the freezing November night, and vanished from his life forever. Connor was left completely alone in the massive echoing mansion. The 30 days granted by the eviction notice slipped away with terrifying speed. He had absolutely no funds to hire professional movers and no friends willing to answer his calls. The people he once hosted at lavish dinner parties had entirely blocked his number. The wealthy investors who used to drink his expensive scotch now treated him like a contagious disease. He packed his remaining clothes into cheap cardboard boxes, hauling them himself into the back of a rented commercial van. The physical labor was a harsh preview of his impending future. He remembered how his father used to lift heavy crates of supplies to build the family business, while Connor complained about waking up early. Now he was sweating through his clothes just trying to salvage his basic necessities. He surrendered the brass keys to a silent property manager and drove away from Lake Forest just as the first heavy snow of winter began to fall. His new reality was a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the far edge of the city. The building smelled intensely of stale cooking oil and damp concrete. The walls were paper-thin, offering absolutely no insulation from the shouting neighbors or the rattling elevated train tracks nearby. He sat on a cheap mattress on the floor, listening to the hissing radiator, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his spectacular failure. There was no smart home technology to control the temperature, and no private chef to prepare his meals. He survived on cheap processed food and tap water. The isolation was completely maddening. Without his money to buy attention, he discovered that his personality was entirely hollow. He had spent years cultivating a facade of superiority, but underneath the designer clothes, there was nothing but a frightened, insecure boy who had stolen from his own family to feel important. The threat of federal fraud charges hung over his head like a sharpened blade. His father had mercifully decided not to press criminal charges for the embezzlement, but the federal tax agencies were not as forgiving. To keep the authorities at bay and negotiate any kind of leniency, Connor needed to show legitimate taxable income immediately. The prestigious investment firms that once courted him now rejected his applications without a second glance. His reputation was entirely toxic. He was forced to accept a grueling entry-level management position at a regional logistics warehouse. The hours were incredibly brutal. He woke up long before dawn, commuting through freezing traffic to stand under harsh fluorescent lights for 10 hours a day. He tracked inventory on a cold concrete floor, taking orders from supervisors he would have previously mocked. The men and women he worked alongside did not care about his former title or his past wealth. They only cared if he could pull his weight during the heavy delivery shifts. The physical labor stripped away his tailored suits and his inflated swagger. His hands grew calloused, and his back ached constantly. He would return to his miserable apartment every night too exhausted to even turn on the television. He simply collapsed onto the mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. The profound arrogance that had defined his entire adult life was systematically ground into dust by the harsh, unrelenting reality of simple survival. He was no longer a master of the universe dictating terms to his naive parents. He was just a man paying for his crimes one exhausting shift at a time. The financial umbilical cord was permanently severed, and the brutal truth of the working world had finally forced him to grow up. The profound lesson embedded in this journey is that true love sometimes requires the implementation of absolute uncompromising boundaries. Providing endless financial support to an entitled individual does not cure their greed, it merely enables their destructive behavior. Real respect cannot be purchased with stolen wealth or endless sacrifices. It must be earned through accountability and the harsh reality of personal consequence. When we remove the artificial cushion of money, we force people to confront their true character. Forgiveness is a powerful tool for healing, but it must never be confused with permission to repeat the abuses of the past. Please share your thoughts on establishing firm family boundaries in the comments section below.